Are you ready to plunge into the last days of a queen who ruled with iron resolve and a heart of silk? Picture this: a monarch's secrets haunting the shadows, a love that bled her soul dry, and a kingdom waiting for her final breath. Let's peel back the velvet curtain on Queen Amara's last, lingering nights. In the dying glow of winter's hearth, Queen Amara of Westland found herself teetering on the brink of an ending she'd long delayed. Her regnant age of brilliance, cunning alliances, and ruthless triumph was nearly over, and the cold hand of mortality had begun to tap at her shoulder. Gone was the lively spark of the court, the music, and the laughter that once spilled through the golden halls of Rosedawn Keep. In its place was a hush as deep as the midnight fog. By the turn of the year, Amara's 70th winter had come, an age few dared dream of in Westland's harsh and plague-haunted courts. Her famed alabaster complexion, once polished to a moonlit glow with powders and potions, had surrendered to time's relentless brush. Her fiery copper wigs, once a crown of defiance and youth, now perched atop a frame that quivered beneath silks. Yet the queen's mind still cut as sharp as a winter blade, even as her limbs grew weary of the weight of command. For 44 unbroken years, Queen Amara had stood alone at the helm. She had outwitted rivals, turned would-be suitors into ashes, and silenced every murmur of rebellion. But the iron that once girded her spirit was beginning to rust. Courtiers noticed first in whispers. The queen's appetite had vanished. Her presence at court grew as rare as moonlight in a storm. The flame that once blazed from her seat of power at Sunspire Palace flickered low, a pale echo of former grandeur. Rumors soon seeped like cold drafts through the velvet tapestries. They said Queen Amara was fading, that the woman who had commanded armies and cowed kingdoms was now a ghost in waiting. The execution of Sir Rowan Everhart, her beloved champion and trusted confidant, had broken her heart as thoroughly as his death had sealed her fate. Though Sir Rowan's rebellion had been treachery, some whispered it had been fueled by a love she would not return. Others insisted it was a twisted devotion she had once encouraged with a careless smile. Watching Rowan walk the final steps to the blade had cracked something deep inside her. She never recovered from that grief, not truly. In the final stretch of that bitter winter, she would stand for hours, refusing the comfort of her bed, the solace of sleep. Servants spoke in hushed awe of her silence, her stillness. When she spoke, her voice was a sigh of memory, more air than word. In the glow of dying embers, she would stare through the empty hearth, her eyes lost in worlds none could see. Physicians tried in vain potions and prayers, hot poultices and cold compresses. Nothing roused the queen. Ministers, ever polite, begged her to name an heir, to grant them the shape of tomorrow. She only shook her head, a gesture both gentle and final. There was a weight pressing down on her greater than politics, heavier even than her crown. As February gave way to March, the truth settled in the hearts of those closest to her. Queen Amara's story was ending. The once merry halls of Rosedawn Keep, known for their music and laughter, had grown somber. Gone were the vibrant dances and shimmering banquets. In their place was a watchful, uneasy silence. The queen had retreated into herself, wrapped in layers of brocade, her face pale as dawn frost. Council meetings were abandoned, royal audiences postponed, without explanation. Even her daily rides, once a testament to her vigor and pride, were no more. Her ladies-in-waiting, those bright, chatty voices, who had shared her secrets and dressed her in silks, were dismissed, one by one. Only Lady Mira, her most trusted attendant, remained. Lady Mira spoke softly, as though each word might fracture her queen's fragile calm. "It's time to rest, Your Majesty," she urged one night, voice trembling with care. "Let me bring the lavender water, the sweet milk. It will ease your mind." But Queen Amara only gazed past her, eyes glinting with something that was not quite fear, nor quite peace. "I will not lie down," Amara whispered. "Not yet." She feared sleep itself, feared that to lay her body down was to invite death to climb beneath her ribs. So she stood by the window, by the bed, by the door, her frail hands clutching the heavy curtains, her lips moving in silent confessions. When she could no longer stand, she sat stiffly, back straight as a blade, her breath coming in shallow sighs. The rumors grew as the queen's strength waned. Was it simply the bite of age, or something darker? Courtiers argued in whispers. Some claimed she was cursed for the blood she had spilled. Others said she was haunted by memories that refused to die. Her skin grew ever paler, her once vibrant frame seeming to vanish within the folds of her royal gowns. Physicians fretted over her wasted figure, but she refused their ministrations. Even as her cough worsened, she kept them at bay with a regal wave of her hand. In those final weeks, a name rose again and again from her lips, Rowan. Some nights, Lady Mira found her queen murmuring to the cold night air, as if he still lingered in the shadows of the room. "Rowan, you fool," she would say, voice thick with regret. "Did you think I would follow you to the end?" The court, once a stage of shimmering silk and velvet laughter, was a ghost of its former self. No more songs of victory, no more pageantry of state. Just the rhythmic creak of the keep's ancient timbers and the hush of servants' footsteps in the dark. Lady Mira watched over her queen, each hour a battle between hope and dread. She brought warm tea, sweetmeats, anything to coax Amara's strength back. But the queen barely touched them, lost in her own mind. By March's bitter breath, even the flicker of humor in Amara's eye had gone out. Ministers begged to name a successor, to ensure the realm would not fall to ruin. But she only turned away, the sharp planes of her face as inscrutable as marble. They said she clung to life not for herself, but for the kingdom she had woven from shadow and steel. She was Westland's soul, and she would not surrender it easily. One icy evening, a young physician named Alaric dared to challenge her. "Majesty, if you will not eat, you must drink," he implored, kneeling before her with a steaming cup of rose tea. "Your strength is the strength of the realm." Amara lifted her chin. "The realm will endure," she said softly, almost as if reassuring him rather than herself. "I am but a vessel. When I am gone, let them forge a new dawn." She did not drink. She did not yield. As the days turned to weeks, the weight of the queen's final winter became a presence in the keep, thick as the tapestries that lined its ancient halls. Ministers moved like ghosts themselves, their voices hushed in corridors that once echoed with laughter. Servants tiptoed, eyes wide, unsure whether they were witnessing the end of a queen or the slow eclipse of a legend. One dawn, as a pale sun pushed through the frost-glazed windows, Lady Mira found her queen seated on the window bench, her back rigid, her breath a whisper of ice. She was gazing into the distance, as though she saw something beyond the horizon, a promise or a threat. "Rowan," Amara murmured again, "do you see me now? Will you wait for me?" Lady Mira touched her shoulder. "Your Majesty, you must rest." Amara turned to her, a flicker of the old fire in her eyes. "I will rest when I am ready," she said, her voice still the echo of command. And so she remained there, in that final chamber of silence and memory. The court waited with bated breath for the inevitable, each hour stretching into eternity. Beyond the heavy oak doors, the kingdom of Westland braced itself for the dawn of a new chapter, a chapter that would begin with the last breath of a queen who had once ruled the world. Let's dive deeper into the grief-soaked final chapter of a queen whose kingdom was as fragile as her own reflection. When Sir Rowan's head fell beneath the blade of Tower Gate, something within Queen Amara splintered like glass beneath a hammer. That day, the echoes of his death wove themselves into the shadows of her chambers and the hollows of her heart. From that moment, those closest to her claimed the queen was no longer the iron sovereign they'd always known. It wasn't simply sorrow that changed her. It was a gnawing sense of guilt that corroded her soul. Lady Mira whispered that the queen kept a locket close to her breast, a tiny portrait of Rowan's defiant gaze. Other servants claimed they heard her sigh his name in the darkness, a broken prayer that flickered like candlelight in a storm. Were these stories true, or the desperate fancies of courtiers, desperate to weave tragedy into poetry? No one could say, but the change in Queen Amara was undeniable. She had once been untouchable, a figure of regal certainty and ruthless wit. Now she seemed achingly human fragile, burdened, and terribly alone. In those days, the word grief had no language of understanding. What we might now name as depression was then seen as a sickness of the soul, a melancholic curse rather than an ache of the mind. Those who served her saw it plainly in her dimmed eyes, her silenced laughter, and her faltering spirit. Once, the court had danced to the music of her laughter. Ministers had vied for her favor, each word and gesture a performance for her discerning eye. Now, they moved as if treading on cracked ice. None wished to slip into her melancholy shadow. Her letters, once filled with wry humor and iron resolve, ceased altogether. Royal decrees went unsigned. Even the hallowed halls of chapel saw her no more a shocking withdrawal for a queen so devout. But perhaps the greatest sign of all was her rejection of music. Amara had lived her life to the rhythm of melody flutes in the garden, lutes in the hall, her own sweet voice echoing through the night. Now she asked only for silence. A silence so profound it felt like a tomb, and the music of her court fell silent with her. By the second winter of 603, the queen's withering spirit could no longer be disguised. What had begun as private mourning soon unfurled before the whole realm. Her decline became a sad performance, each silent step watched by those who once cheered her triumphs. The queen who had stood against foreign kings and quieted all dissent now seemed adrift in her own kingdom, the weight of her memories pressing her down. Amara refused to speak of her condition. Even when the kingdom's business demanded her voice, she offered only faint gestures on incline of the head, a flick of her pale fingers. Days passed with barely a word, her silence a vast chasm that no one dared to cross. Advisors, wiry old men who had served her since youth, pressed her gently for counsel. The line of succession, the future of Westland, even her own frail health, but she turned away from them all, as if each question was another stone on her chest. Physicians, summoned with frantic urgency, gathered in hushed clusters outside her chamber. They debated in murmurs. Was it a failing of the vital humors, a fever of the mind, or something more sinister? They prescribed tinctures of rosewater and bitter herbs, ordered warm compresses for her pale temples, but no cure found a place in her stubborn heart. How could it, when no one understood the sickness that gripped her? In those weeks, her posture itself became an emblem of her mind's turmoil. She refused to recline, refused to surrender her upright dignity to the weight of illness. For hours, sometimes for days, she stood or sat stiff-backed on the cushioned bench by the window. Her thin hands gripped the arms of her chair, as though the cold wood was the last thing tethering her to life. In the dark hours of night, servants took turns watching her. Some claimed she was lost in prayer. Others believed she was adrift in memories that would not let her rest. The keep around her fell into a quiet dread. Gone were the bright, echoing footsteps of dancing lords and ladies. In their place came the hush of velvet slippers in dim corridors. Courtiers held their breath. Nobles paced the antechambers, each of them keenly aware that every silent hour was a prelude to the end. And beyond those locked doors, an entire realm waited for news of whether their queen would rally or fade away. In that silence, a storm of uncertainty brewed. Westland had no clear heir, no blood-bonded promise of stability. Though many believed Prince Alaric of the Northern Cliffs, her distant cousin, would claim the throne, none could be sure. Without Amara's voice to command it, even a rightful claim was just another page in the kingdom's long, dark ledger of power and betrayal. The hush that blanketed the palace was not just the queen's sit, was the whole realm's breath, held tight against the coming storm. Whispers thickened into fearful speculation. Some claimed the queen was bewitched, her mind ensnared by old magics. Others blamed the weight of her own memories, the faces of the dead that she could not lay to rest. But one tale, whispered with a chill shiver, carried the weight of truth, that the queen's slow demise was of her own making. Queen Amara had long cloaked herself in a porcelain mask layers of shimmering powder that turned her face into an icon of immortal beauty. This powder, a blend of rare vinegars and gleaming white dust, was more than a cosmetic. It was a symbol of power, a shroud of elegance that no mortal eye could pierce. But woven into that powder was the bitter poison of white lead, a poison that seeped through her skin day after day, year after year. Applied with a careful hand each dawn, the lead crept beneath her skin. At first, it lent her the glow of moonlight and the aura of eternal youth. But over the years, it burrowed deeper, whispering ruin to her bones and mind. The slow, hidden death of lead poisoning fatigue that stole her strength, tremors that shook her steady hand, confusion that clouded her brilliant mind. It blackened her teeth, thinned her once glorious copper hair to ragged wisps. Sores and blemishes festered beneath the mask, hidden from all but her most loyal attendants. Still, she would not abandon the illusion. Even as her skin grew fragile and pocked, she demanded that the white mask be applied each day, each stroke a quiet denial of her mortality. "I am the queen," she once told Lady Mira, voice thin as wind. "I will not be seen as anything else." Servants spoke in hushed awe of how the queen's reflection had become her prison. She would gaze into the silvered mirrors of her bedchamber, searching for a girl she could no longer find. The court's last glimpses of her were as a figure of almost spectral beauty, white as bone, silent as a tomb, wrapped in silks that draped her shrinking frame. In those final weeks, it was as though she had become the ghost of her own legend. The courtiers who once knelt at her feet now watched in dread, knowing that the end of Queen Amara would be the end of an age. And so they waited for her last breath, for the final sigh that would release the kingdom into the uncertain dawn beyond. Let me tell you the truth of a queen whose perfect image was both her greatest strength and her cruelest torment. Queen Amara's face was a mask of immortal beauty, an icy white shield against the decay of time itself. But as that mask cracked, so too did the woman behind it, each flake of powder a slow poison seeping into her soul. It wasn't just vanity that drove Amara to smear the deadly white paste across her face. Each dawn it was armor. In a world of cunning barons and treacherous dukes, appearances meant survival. And her powdered mask was the final wall she could build against the encroaching darkness. But every armor carries a hidden cost, and this one was a poison that would eat at her from within. Modern scholars have since uncovered the truth, that the mixture known as alabaster veil, so prized in Amara's time, was a brew of vinegar and lethal white lead. Day after day, year after year, she pressed it to her skin until it claimed her mind, body, and spirit. Historians now argue that the lead poisoning may have been the silent architect of her collapse. The irritability that turned to cold fury, the hollow confusion, the refusal to sleep or eat, even the unending melancholy that trailed her after Sir Rowan's death. These were not just shadows of her soul, they were the whispers of poison in her blood. But in her age, such dangers were invisible. The alabaster veil was no secret to be feared. It was a mark of nobility, worn proudly by queens across all of Virendale's courts. It was imported, treasured, and painted on every noble brow. The very mask that made Queen Amara an icon, the pale, perfect face that cowed ambassadors and bewitched poets, may have been the slow, cruel hand that hastened her end. By the second week of March, in the year 603, the Queen's final winter had become an undeniable tragedy. Courtiers moved through the halls of Rosedawn Keep with careful steps, careful smile surgency tucked beneath layers of courtesy. They saw that she no longer ate, that her body, once draped in jewels and silks, had withered into a fragile shadow. Her once proud figure seemed to collapse inward, her shoulders bowed beneath the weight of invisible chains. None could name her illness. In those days, the physicians of Virendale clung to the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They measured balance not with instruments but with the pulse of a wrist and the color of a cheek. If one humor outweighed the others, sickness crept in. So they turned to their potions and prayers, bitter herbs steeped in iron pots, warm compresses for cold skin, endless cups of rosewater and honey. But the Queen's body resisted all of it. Her decline was a puzzle no learned man could solve. Some whispered of pneumonia, the chill air of Rosedawn Keep snatching warmth from her bones as she stood rigid for hours. A persistent cough, and a slow fog in her mind. These matched the signs of lung fever that would have meant death in any age, for even the mildest case was a mortal threat in a world without cures. Others insisted it was blood poisoning, a grim consequence of the queen's poor teeth. Her once radiant smile had been marred for years. Teeth had blackened. Some had even fallen away. Infections that began in the mouth, left unchecked, could slip into the blood, turning even the strongest heart to a failing drumbeat. Today, we call it sepsis then. They called it a mystery. But in Queen Amara's day, none could name it. None could treat it. So they tried everything and nothing. Herbal tonics that promised to balance her humors. Hot cloths pressed to her chest in hope of easing her rattling breath. Sweet lavender oil dabbed on her temples to calm the queen who would not be calmed. And always, prayers whispered into the night prayers that went unanswered. Through it all, Queen Amara refused every attempt to treat her. She would not let them cut her skin, not let them bleed her veins. She would not even allow them to see the body that was betraying her. Even in the shadow of death, she clung to the dignity of her station, refusing to undress completely, her modesty a final fortress. The silence around her grew thicker, as though the very walls of her chamber were holding their breath. Servants tiptoed, fearful to speak above a whisper. Her ladies, loyal to the end, wept in secret. Ministers stood by helplessly, knowing that the woman who had been their sovereign for decades was slipping from their grasp not with a roar, but like a candle's last sigh, soft and final. No one knew how to save her. No one even knew what to call the sickness that consumed her. And so they did the only thing they could. They waited. They watched as the queen, who had once bent kingdoms to her, now sat in stillness, her lips sealed against every question. They waited for a miracle, or for the gentle hand of death to claim her. Yet it wasn't only the poisons of lead and sickness that drew her down. It was the weight of her Rulia burden that pressed into her very bones. For more than 4 decades, Queen Amara had carried the fate of Westland on her narrow shoulders. She had been the architect of triumphs, the shield against every threat, the voice that sang both command and comfort. That crown was never light. It was a yoke that left her hunched even in her strongest days. Now, in these final nights, that weight bore down upon her spirit like a storm. She was a queen whose mind was still a fortress of memory and regret, even as her body crumbled beneath her silks. And so she clung to that one last illusion, the white mask she wore each day, each careful layer of alabaster veil that hid the mortal ruin beneath. In her final hours, those who entered her chamber saw not a queen in decline, but a figure of spectral beauty pale as moonlight, silent as the tomb. Lady Mira, ever faithful, watched over her in those long, silent nights, her heart breaking at the sight. She would bring warm broth and soft linen, hoping for a word, a sign that the queen was still there behind those haunted eyes. But Amara would only shake her head, the hint of a smile on her cracked lips. "The realm must endure," she would whisper in her low, fading voice. "The realm must endure." Outside the doors of her chamber, the future of Westland hung in the balance. Nobles and courtiers stood vigil in the cold halls, waiting for a signony, sign that the queen's last breath would not be the kingdom's undoing. And so the palace of Rosedawn Keep stood in perfect stillness, caught between the memory of her reign and the dawn of what must come after. For decades, Queen Amara of Westland had embodied an empire's relentless will. Her crown wasn't just an ornament of gold and jewels. It was a living force, fed by every shrewd alliance she forged, every calculated word she spoke, every challenge she crushed beneath her heel. But in the still, breathless hush of her final chamber, that crown now sat cold and waiting. And as the queen's strength waned, the kingdom trembled, for the question of what came next loomed larger than any shadow. Amara had no children, no heir of her own blood. The line of House Ellender, a dynasty woven from centuries of ambition and bloodshed, would end with her. Through a lifetime of maneuvering and ironclad resolve, she had refused to name her successor. And perhaps the reason was simple. To name one was to admit the inevitable. To speak the name of her heir was to face her own mortality, something she had fought off with every breath until now. All eyes in the realm turned to Prince Alaric of the Northern Cliffs, a distant cousin with a claim through his grandmother, once a sister to the Ellender line. He was young, Protestant, and male, with the right name in his veins, but his claim was tangled in old rivalries and hidden grudges. There were still those who whispered of other claimants of Catholic bloodlines stirring in the dark, of nobles with private armies and ancient grievances. The Queen's decline stirred these old hatreds from their slumber. Ministers clustered around her, especially the ever-watchful Chancellor Rold, who pressed her with calm but urgent pleas. "Your Majesty, the realm stands at the edge of a blade. We must not let the kingdom slip into ruin." His voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of fear. For Westland had known civil war in living memory. The taste of blood and betrayal was never truly forgotten. But Queen Amara met his entreaties with silence. Some claimed she offered a subtle nod when asked if Alaric should be crowned. Others swore they heard her murmur, "No bastard prince shall wear my crown," only to relent in the end. Yet no record exists, no final testament. The woman who had shaped kingdoms with her voice fell silent when the kingdom needed it most. Perhaps in her heart, acknowledging Alaric as her heir meant admitting the sun was setting on her Reignon, her world. As March crawled forward and the icy winds rattled the tapestries of Rosedawn Keep, those closest to the Queen began to see something strange and unsettling. She would not sleep. Night and day, she sat or stood in the flickering candlelight, her body a monument to defiance. The lines of her face grew sharper, her breath more labored, but she refused the softness of a bed. It was as if she believed that to close her eyes was to invite the final darkness she had so long kept at bay. At first, her attendants tried to coax her. Lady Mira brought warm milk laced with honey. Soothing melodies played on the harp. But Amara turned it all away with a wave of her trembling hand. "No comfort," she would rasp, her eyes bright and haunted. "I will not be lulled to rest." In the old beliefs of Westland, sleep was a fleeting death, a moment when the soul wandered beyond the Valand. Perhaps even the brilliant mind of Queen Amara feared that if she gave in to that dark drift, she would never rise again. She would sit, hunched and silent, her head resting against the high wooden panels of her chamber walls. Her legs swelled from the endless hours upright. Her breathing grew shallow and ragged. Yet still, she would not lie down. She collapsed several times, her frail body crumpling like silk in the candlelight. Once, Lady Mira found her slumped by the window, her lips moving in a prayer no one could hear. After that, her ladies took turns watching over Herculean sentinels in a room where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. They no longer spoke unless she spoke first. The hush was absolute, a reverence mixed with dread, as if each breath was a thread of fate holding the realm together. When at last she allowed them to lift her into bed, it was not a choice of peace, but of final surrender. Her body had simply given out. They wrapped her in sheets of the finest silk, laying her as gently as one might lower a relic into a sacred vault. For many who watched, that single moment felt like the first crack in the world's foundations. The silence of her chamber deepened, thick as the winter's frost. Ministers gathered Chancellor Rold, Lady Mira, the royal physician Master Aldenich, aware that what they were witnessing was more than the death of a woman. It was the death of an age. The dynasty of Ellender, which had ruled with iron and splendor for more than a century, would die with her final breath. Beyond those thick oak doors, the palace itself seemed to pause. The echoing footfalls of servants fell quiet. Courtiers moved through the halls like wraiths, voices hushed to a reverent murmur. No proclamations were sent out, no bells tolled in the city below. Only a ripple of whispers flowed through Rosedawn Keep, growing with every passing hour. Those who had served her for decades stood at the threshold of her final vigil. They watched for any sign of flicker of recognition, a whispered word. But Queen Amara, who had once spoken with the thunder of command, now offered only faint gestures, the tiniest movements of her fingers, the softest shifts of her hollowed eyes. Some said they saw her hand drift toward the silver circlet resting on a nearby table, a final acknowledgement of the crown she would soon leave behind. Others claimed she turned her gaze to a portrait of Prince Alaric, as if passing the torch without words. But there were no declarations, no final decree to etch itself into history's endless pages. What visions haunted her as she lay in that twilight silence? Did she remember the girl she had been a prisoner in her sister's dark tower? Did she see herself at the head of her army, her voice ringing out across the cold fields of battle? Did she recall the feasts of poets and philosophers, the long nights of wine and whispered secrets? The execution of her cousin, the death of the man she had loved, and Kiladivery triumph, every shadow of her reign. Outside her chamber, the kingdom braced for what was to come. Courtiers quietly packed away silken gowns and jeweled finery, their future as uncertain as the dawn. Ambassadors penned secret letters to distant kings, while messengers stood ready in the stables. Horses saddled for the news they would carry to every corner of the realm. They all knew the final moment was close. And, until her last breath, Westland was a realm without a sovereign caught between the memory of a queen and the uncertain promise of her heir. Yet for all the gravity of this passing, Queen Amara spoke no final farewell. The woman whose words had silenced parliaments, whose voice had bent even the hardest hearts, would leave no last testament. Her kingdom, her council, her people, she left them in the hush of a room where only the flicker of candles and the faint rustle of silk marked the passing of time. The end came softly, a slow exhale that carried with it the weight of an era, the last breath of a queen who had been both conqueror and captive of her own destiny. The crown that had defined her now lay still, untouched, and with her final breath, the age of Queen Amara came to its close. No declarations, no parting words, only the silence of a world forever changed. Even in her final moments, Queen Amara of Westland remained a monarch untouched, unchallenged, until her last breath slipped into the hush of her chamber. No one dared claim her crown. The weight of her legacy, the shadows of her choices, it all hung in the air like the final note of a mournful song. The dying hours of Queen Amara's life unfolded like a dream half remembered. Those who gathered in her chamber stood like solemn statues, each face carved with sorrow and uncertainty. No voice dared break the reverent quiet. The queen lay still, her breathing shallow and faltering, her once radiant skin turned to the color of old parchment. The fire in her soul had dwindled to a flicker, each breath a fragile echo of the sovereign she had been. Lady Mira, steadfast in her vigil, refused to leave the queen's side. She held Amara's delicate hand, brushing her forehead with linen scented with rosewater. Behind her, the other ladies watched in quiet grief, their lips moving in silent prayer, some whispered aloud, some swallowed by trembling hearts. There was no script for this farewell. No queen had ever walked this lonely path before. Beyond the walls of Rosedawn Keep, the air was thick with waiting. No word of her passing had yet been spoken. No proclamation dared uttered. Messengers in the courtyard shifted restlessly in their saddles, eyes fixed on the silent windows of the queen's chamber. They waited to ride to the northern cliffs, to bear the news to Prince Alaric, the man who would become king if fate and the queen allowed it. Inside, time moved strangely. Minutes stretched into hours, each breath of the queen a question mark hanging in the air. Even Chancellor Rold, the cunning mind behind the fragile peace that would soon bind Westland to the northern cliffs, stood silent. His papers, the drafts of treaties and plans, lay folded in his hands. He had spent years weaving the web of Union England and the northern cliffs, two thrones bound by one crown, yet all of it hinged on the slow, final breaths of the woman before him. Then, in the cold stillness before dawn, on the 24th of March, the end came at last. No cry, no final gasp, just a hush. The room held its breath with her. A kingdom's heartbeat stilled in that single instant. For a moment, no one moved, as if any sound might call her spirit back. Then, quietly, Lady Mira reached out and drew a linen cloth over the queen's face. It was done. Queen Amara of Westland was dead. There was no grand pronouncement, no priest's final blessing. She had refused them all. The queen who had commanded armies and silenced kings slipped from life with no ceremony, but the respectful silence of those who had loved and served her. The queen who had risen from scandal and shadows to rule with iron dignity had passed alone her final moment, as private as her deepest thoughts. The Virgin Queen, as poets had called her, had died not in a blaze of triumph, but in a gentle hush. She had ruled a world of fire and intrigue, of devotion and betrayal, and now she passed into legend with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through every storm. Outside, the chill of dawn seeped through the stones of the keep, a shiver that ran down every spine in the kingdom. Her death was not unexpected, but it was no less unsettling. A throne without a voice, a kingdom without its lodestar Westland, trembled on the edge of a new age, unsure of its next breath. For many in the realm, Queen Amara had been the only ruler they had ever known. Her image had been stamped on coin and conscience alike, woven into the songs of children and the prayers of the devout. Now that image lay still, her face hidden beneath linen, her voice silenced forever. In those first moments after her passing, the queen's body was left untouched, a symbol of the respect owed to a monarch whose shadow had loomed over an age. Her ladies kept their silent watch, whispering psalms through tears. A single candle burned at her bedside, the flame flickering like the spirit it honored. The cloth drawn over her face did not erase hair, it preserved her, a final testament to the woman she had been, as if the kingdom itself needed one last heartbeat to believe she was truly gone. But even as grief filled the air of Rosedawn, the machinery of power began to turn. Chancellor Rold, alone among them, moved with purpose. He had spent years preparing for this moment, weaving secret letters to Prince Alaric, ensuring that the realm would not fall to chaos. Now, those letters would be more than words, they would be lifelines for a kingdom teetering on the brink. Messengers were summoned, horses were readied. They would ride out at dawn, their hoofbeats carrying the news across muddy roads and watchful borders. The final chapter of one queen's reign had ended, but the first breath of a new one was already stirring. In the cold corridors of Rosedawn Keep, the courtiers moved like shadows. Some gathered their cloaks and jewels, their future as uncertain as the dawn. Others simply waited for the word that would send them scurrying to pledge fealty to a new crown. Outside, the restless city of Westhaven waited too, listening for the news that would ripple from the keep's high towers to every dusty lane and distant farmstead. The Virgin Queen was dead. Her body lay still, watched by the soft glow of candlelight and the haunted eyes of those who had stood with her through triumph and tragedy. She had been more than a queen. She had been a force of nature, a myth in living flesh. And now she was gone, her secrets sealed behind cold lips. Yet even in death, Queen Amara's presence lingered. In the hush of her chamber, in the solemn faces of her ladies, in the uncertain eyes of her ministers, she was still there, woven into the stones and the sighs of the keep. And beyond those ancient walls, the kingdom she had held in her hand stood poised on the cusp of a new chapter, waiting for the crown that would soon find a new brow to rest upon. No bells tolled, no official mourning was declared. In those first breathless hours after Queen Amara's death, the court wrapped itself in a hush of secrecy, each wary of the power that might slip through cracks in their silence. They knew the peril of ambition unleashed, the specter of opportunists who might rise before her crown had grown cold. And so they said nothing. But word, like water through stone, seeped out. At first, it was servants who carried the secret in trembling whispers. Then it drifted to merchants and clergy, until at last the quiet truth touched every ear. The queen was gone. And with her, the age of House Ellender was gone as well. There was no child, no brother or sister groomed to claim her throne. Queen Amara had left behind no heir of her own flesh, only the fragile promise that her silent nods would be honored, and that the kingdom she had ruled so fiercely would not crumble into dust. In the echoing halls of Rosedawn Keep, the Privy Council gathered in urgent council, voices low and uncertain. The kingdom teetered on a knife's edge. Factions stirred in the shadow, some still loyal to the old faith, others to ancient family grudges. Memories of past bloodshed hovered like ghosts, reminding them of how easily a throne could turn to a battlefield. Yet for all the queen's silence, the government had prepared. They had known this day would come. Within hours of her death, the council declared that Prince Alaric of the Northern Cliffs would be crowned as Alaric I of Westland. A new dynasty began, even as the old one's final breath still lingered in the cold corridors of the keep. And though the nation turned its gaze to the dawn of a new reign, it did so in the shadow of grief, mourning the woman whose rule had shaped an age and whose silence now spoke louder than any proclamation. With the matter of succession settled, the council turned to the queen herself. Queen Amara, who had spent her life mastering every detail of her appearance, could no longer shield herself from the gaze of the world. In life, her image had been her armor, every inch of her, painted, powdered, and draped in finery to project power and command respect. Even in her final days, she had darkened her chamber and turned away visitors, clinging to the illusion that to show weakness was to invite ruin. But death allows no secrets. As her ladies prepared her body for the rites of farewell, they saw the truths she had hidden beneath layers of white lead and silk. Her skin, once powdered into a mask of perfection, now lay bare-marked by bruises, by lesions, by the sickly pallor that years of poison had wrought. Her hands, which had wielded the scepter of Westland, were thin and brittle. Her hair, once a crown of flame, had turned to a wisp of white strands. Queen Amara had been dying long before she would admit it. The final days of her reign had been a careful dance of denial, but now in death there was no more hiding. And yet there was something achingly human in that revelation. She was no longer the mythical queen of pageants and paradesno, longer the figure of marble etched in poems and portraits. She was a woman who had carried a kingdom's fate in her hands for decades, and in the end, had paid the price in flesh and spirit. There was no rush to bury her. Tradition demanded patience, time for the kingdom to mourn, to honor the weight of her passing. Her body lay in state, clad in her final royal finery. Above her brow, the circlet of her crown rested, an emblem of power she would never lift again. At her side lay the orb and scepter, the symbols of rule she had once held with unshakable confidence. For all the blemishes now visible, her people came in hushed throngs to bow their heads. They came not just to honor a queen, but to stand in the presence of a woman who had been fierce and fragile, brilliant and burdened. The mask had fallen away at last. What remained was not diminishingly made real. It was not until the 28th of April, over a month after Queen Amara's death, that her body was finally laid to rest. The delay was not a failure of duty, but a testament to the weight of her reign. A monarch who had outlasted kings, weathered conspiracies, and forged an empire in her name could not be consigned to the earth without a ceremony worthy of her legend. The day of her funeral dawned gray and somber, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to echo the grief of the realm. The procession began at the ancient gates of Brightfall Tower and wound its slow way through the cobbled streets of Westhaven toward the Abbey of St. Verena. The city itself stood in silence, see no cheers, no revelry, only the low toll of bells and the measured tread of boots on stone. Nobles in velvet cloaks and lords in somber black lined the streets. Priests in white and gold offered prayers as the great carriage rolled past, its weight carried by 4 black horses draped in mourning cloth. Above the coffin, a carved effigy of the queen lay in state, final image of the monarch as she had wished to be remembered. And the people came, commoners and merchants, mothers and soldiers. They stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes turned toward the woman who had been more than a sovereign. She had been their protector, their symbol, the heart of a kingdom that had grown in her shadow. Some wept, tears tracing lines of sorrow down weathered cheeks. Others watched in silence, heads bowed as if the hush itself was a prayer. No songs rose in the air that day, only the muffled rhythm of footsteps and the heavy sigh of wind. The queen was gone, and with her passed an age of ambition and empire, of secrets and splendor. But in that final, solemn procession, every soul who watched knew they were seeing the close of a chapter that would never be written again. Queen Amara had gone to her rest, leaving behind a world forever changed. And though the crown had found a new brow to grace, the silence of her passing would linger like a ghost in the halls of power and in the hearts of those who had loved and feared her in equal measure. Queen Amara, clad in regal robes and draped in velvet's hush, was laid out in final splendor, her crown, her orb, and her scepter arrayed like silent sentinels. Her eyes, painted open in death's still theater, gazed serenely forward, as if even now she watched over her kingdom. The lifelike effigy, so vivid in detail, convinced many it was no mere statue but the queen herself held upright in one last act of sovereignty. Behind the great hearse moved an honor guard, the echo of steel and duty in every measured step. Nobles of her court, the aging lords and bright-eyed heirs, followed in solemn ranks. Members of the High Council, ambassadors from foreign lands clad in silks and sable furs, marched in steady procession. Each footfall seemed to carry the weight of more than a funeral. This was the burial of an entire chapter of history. At the Abbey of St. Verena, Queen Amara was interred in the ancient vault beside her half-sister, Queen Merentwo's sovereigns, who had spent their lives in rivalry and wary alliance, now united in the hush of stone. On their shared tomb, the inscription was carved with careful hand: "Partners in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Amara and Mirren." In the hope of one resurrection, historians could not ignore the grim Irana sisters divided in life, reunited in death's unyielding embrace. For the funeral was more than the farewell of a queen. It marked the end of the House of Elendar, the dynasty that had carried Westland from the embers of civil strife into an age of wonder and conquest. With Amara's death, that line ended, leaving the realm to look to the horizon of what might come next. As the abbey's doors closed behind her coffin, the kingdom stood changed. The Amaran age was over, and what future would rise in its place was yet unwritten. More than 4 centuries have passed since that day, and still the mystery of Queen Amara's death draws whispers. Unlike rulers who fell to sword or sickness declared in bright halls, her final decline was draped in silence, woven of contradictions and secrets. Scholars and healers, poets and curious souls have all tried to piece together what truly claimed the last breath of a queen who seemed to defy time itself. The simplest explanation is perhaps the truest. At nearly 70, she had far outlasted the lives of her contemporaries. Her reign had weathered endless storms, wars, betrayals, the weight of a kingdom resting on her shoulders alone. In the end, even the strongest spirit must bow to the quiet pull of time. Her refusal to eat, to drink, to restitch a nail in the slow coffin of her own making. Without the healing arts we know now, even a gentle illness could bloom into death's final shadow. Yet other voices speak of pneumonia, cold breath of damp air in the drafty halls of Rosedawn Keep, finding a home in the frailty of her body. A cough that would not yield, a fever that whispered in her blood without healer's salves. Even the simplest infection could claim the life of a queen. The chill of those final weeks may have been the final ghost that claimed her. Still, there is the poison no one spoke of then, the lead, that lurked in her famous white mask. For years, Queen Amara's face had been veiled in alabaster powder, her armor, her vanity, her power. But lead seeped beneath her skin, a slow and invisible killer. Modern minds know the cost. A poison that gnaws at the mind, saps the strength, steals the light from the eyes. Fatigue, sudden fury, the soft confusion that steals words from even the brightest mind, all these were the echoes of that poison, creeping in each dawn as she donned her crown of white dust. Others looked to the wound that can't be stitched, or soothed the grief that dogged her like a shadow. The loss of Sir Rowan Everhart, the man she had loved and condemned, tore at her soul in ways no leech or potion could heal. In those final nights, her refusal to lie down, her long silences, the deep well of her sorrow, signs of a mind drowning in melancholy. In an age that had no name for despair, her heart's ache was a final, invisible affliction. Perhaps the truth is not one tale, but a tapestry of them all. Age, sickness, poison, sorrow woven together like the threads of a kingdom's fate. The queen who had carried the burdens of an empire upon her slender shoulders was at last crushed beneath them. In that final hush, Queen Amara of Westland became not just a memory, but a legend of life and death, a riddle that still lingers in the quiet corners of the realm she once ruled. Yet, in the quiet of her last breath, Queen Amara left no confession, only the echo of legend. Her death was not merely the end of a life, but the end of a carefully crafted persona that had cloaked her kingdom for over 40 years. She had ruled alone, a sovereign without consort or child, shaping not just policies but the very soul of Westland with her iron will and theatrical presence. Her passing was quiet, shrouded in privacy and scattered with unspoken questions, but the thunder of her reign rolled far beyond the walls of her bedchamber. The country she left behind was not the fractured realm she had inherited as a young queen riven by civil discord, shadowed by foreign threats, and held together by the thinnest thread of unity. Through sheer determination and shrewd diplomacy, Queen Amara had forged a kingdom that stood proud, vibrant, and respected across the known world. But in the wake of her death, the kingdom's newfound grandeur revealed its fragility. She had held the realm together through sheer force of character, weaving together faith, ambition, and spectacle. Now, with her gone, the question of succession loomed large. The peaceful coronation of Prince Alaric was a triumph of statecraft, a delicate dance of alliances and compromise. Yet it was also a sign of the profound transformation of the realm itself. The house of Ellender's fire had burned out. The house of Aelwyn would carry the torch, though no one yet knew if it would burn as bright. And yet, as the realm turned its gaze to the future, what haunted the hearts of her people was not the politics or the crowns. It was her. The echoes of her speeches, the resolute image she projected, the unyielding refusal to wed or yield. Her bright jewels, her gowns shimmering like moonlight, the high, proud line of her brow, all of it had become part of the legend. Even her final silence became a testament to her legacy, a woman who departed this world on her own terms, with no final word, no plea for remembrance or mercy. Historians have argued endlessly over the details of her death, but there is no debate about her impact. The age of Queen Amara remains enshrined as one of Westland's most luminous chapters, a time of poetry, discovery, and national pride. Her name became a symbol of that golden age, a touchstone for the grandeur that once was. Beneath the cold stones of the Abbey of St. Verena, her body lies in quiet repose, yet her story continues echoing in books and plays, in songs and whispers, in the very air of the halls she once walked. She died alone, but she did not die forgotten. Long before sweet confections filled shop windows or steaming mugs of cocoa warmed winter hands, the cacao bean was something far more potent, bitter, frothy, and revered as a gift from the gods. Our journey begins not in the silken courts of Westland, but 3 millennia earlier in the tangled jungles of what is now southern Viridalia. Here, the Olmec people, among the first architects of civilization in the New World, were likely the earliest to tend the cacao tree. Though much of their history lies buried in the forest floor, evidence suggests that cacao played a vital role in their rituals, perhaps consumed as a sacred drink to commune with the divine. This was no simple indulgence, but a channel of spiritual power. It was the Maya, however, who elevated cacao to a symbol of cosmic connection. Between 250 and 900 CE, the Maya civilization flourished across much of central Viridalia, and cacao became a sacred gift, woven into the myths that defined their world. In their tales, cacao was a divine offering from the creators of life itself, a sign that humanity and the gods were bound together by the taste of this bitter brew. The Popol Vuh, the sacred Maya text, speaks of the first humans shaped from maize and cacao, a testament to their belief that these humble seeds were the roots of existence itself. For the Maya, cacao was for moments of great consequence. Priests poured it in solemn rites, nobles raised it in elaborate feasts, and every cup was believed to carry the drinker closer to the world of spirits. Served cold, mixed with fiery chilies or hearty maize, cacao was a drink to awaken the soul. The rich, dark froth was prized, a sign of its potency and the skill of the one who prepared it. This was not merely refreshment, it was a conduit to the sacred. Beyond its ritual power, cacao was woven into the very economy of Maya life. Beans were currency, clinking softly in the market stalls as traders counted them like coins. A handful could buy a meal, a sack, a feast, and in a world where even currency could be forged from clay, cacao beans were precious enough to draw tricksters and counterfeiters alike. It was not a luxury, it was life itself. Among the Maya, cacao was more than just a bitter drink. It was woven into every ritual and celebration, every vow and parting. When a new ruler rose to power, cups of cacao were raised in blessing. When two hearts were joined in marriage, the bitter brew sealed their bond. And when the dead were laid to rest, they were sent into the next world with vessels of cacao to guide their spirits across the darkness. In every city of the Maya world, from the grand temples of Ixal to the hidden sanctuaries of Copanthe, aroma of cacao was a promise of power and devotion. It was the drink of gods and mortals alike, a bitter thread that bound them to the earth and the heavens beyond. These were no simple drinks to be savored lightly. They were potions of power, blends of bitter magic and bold intention. Cacao was mixed with fiery chilies, with the earthy sweetness of maize, the fragrant touch of vanilla, and sometimes with the very lifeblood of rituals. In the world of the Maya, these brews were more than refreshment. They were gateways, vessels meant to lift the mind and the soul closer to the divine, to stir visions and unlock secrets of the spirit. The Maya believed that cacao trees themselves were sacred, their winding limbs and jewel-toned pods, symbols of life's cycle, fertility, and endless abundance. In their art, cacao appeared in painted murals and chiseled stelae, intertwined with deities and ancestors. There are scenes of kings offering cups of cacao to the gods, and gods themselves bursting from cacao pods born of divine fruit, cradled in green, growing from the earth's hidden fire. Yet cacao's power reached beyond the temples and altars. It was a thread that ran through every corner of Maya life. When guests crossed a threshold, they were welcomed with cacao. When peace was brokered, cups of cacao sealed the pact. To drink cacao was to acknowledge shared humanity, a bond of trust, an understanding spoken without words. Even in the lofty homes of the elite, cacao was never a casual pleasure. It was poured into vessels crafted with care-painted cups marked with glyphs, telling the stories of their owners and the purpose of each drink. These were not merely cups, they were heirlooms, each one a testament to the reverence the Maya felt for the bitter, intoxicating drink that connected them to each other and the cosmos itself. The drinking of cacao was an act of devotion and of power. It was a ritual that balanced the world, one careful sip at a time. Centuries passed, and the torch of cacao was carried into the hands of another mighty empire, the Aztecs. By the time the Spanish, led by Hernán Cortés, set foot in the soaring city of Tenochtitlan in the early 1500s, cacao had become more than a sacred symbol. In the Aztec world, it was currency, medicine, and the drink of kings. The Aztecs could not grow cacao in the cool, dry air of their mountain capital. Instead, they demanded it from the lush southern provinces they conquered, tribute paid in beans that poured into the imperial granaries like rivers of wealth. These granaries were vaults of power, where cacao was counted as carefully as any gold coin. A small rabbit could be bought for 10 beans. A plump turkey hen might cost 100. Servants were paid in cacao. Debts settled with each humble bean, carrying a value that shaped an empire. To forge a counterfeit cacao bean hollowed and filled with dirt was an act of treason, a crime that cut to the very heart of Aztec society. For in Tenochtitlan, cacao was more than currency. It was the blood of warriors, the pulse of kings. Known as Zacatl, it was consumed only by nobles, priests, and the fiercest warriors, never by commoners. Its preparation was an art, a blend of water, maize, and chili that was believed to sharpen the senses and stir the blood before battle. The Emperor Montecayo, known for his grandeur and his iron rule, was said to drink as many as 50 cups each day. To him, cacao was no simple indulgence, it was a key to virility, a tonic of strength and power. In the flickering temples of Tenochtitlan, cacao was also an offering to the gods. Cups of the bitter drink were raised to the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, the trickster god who had stolen cacao from the paradise of the gods and gifted it to mortals. Each sip was a whisper of devotion, a promise to the spirits who watched over the Aztec world. For the Aztecs, cacao was a symbol of conquest and sacrifice. It was the currency of power, the drink of the chosen, the sacred blood that tied their world together. But across the sea, a different hunger stirred. When the Spanish first laid eyes on the cacao bean, they did not see its worth. It was strange, bitter, alien. Yet they watched in fascination as kings and warriors drank it, as priests poured it in reverence. And slowly, they came to understand. This bitter seed was the key to a new empire Rome that would stretch beyond the jungles of Viridalia, across oceans and continents. When Hernán Cortés and his men entered Tenochtitlan in 1519, they were met by a world that dazzled their sense-storing temples crowned with smoke and song, floating gardens that turned the marshes to green jewels, markets that hummed with the music of trade, and in the heart of it all, cacao dark, bitter, alive with promise. The Spanish had come in search of gold and glory. They found something else a drink that would conquer their palates and, in time, their world. The bitter brew of kings and warriors was about to cross the ocean, to be sweetened and softened, reshaped and reborn. In the cups of Spanish nobles, cacao would lose its ancient bite, becoming the rich sweetness we know today. But in that moment, as the Spaniards watched the priests of Tenochtitlan raise the dark, frothy drink to the gods, they saw only a hint of the future one that would turn a sacred ritual into a global obsession. The bitter brew of kings and warriors was a marvel to the Spaniards, who watched as Emperor Montecayo II was served cup after cup of the frothy, dark drink known as zocolotl. In shimmering golden vessels, warriors, priests, and nobles alike drank with reverence. At first, the Europeans found it strange, too bitter, too fiery, unlike anything from their homeland. Many dismissed it as unpleasant, an oddity from a foreign world. But soon, they noticed something else. The sharp alertness it seemed to summon, the spark it lent to every mind that tasted it, and the weight of meaning it carried in every aspect of Aztec life. When the conquest was complete and the mighty empire of Tenochtitlan fell, Hernán Cortés carried back to Spain more than gold and silver. He brought cacao beans, the knowledge of how to grind them, to mix them, to drink them, as the Aztec elite had done for centuries. And with that, the bitter drink of warriors crossed the ocean, making its first quiet ripples in the courts of Europe. At first, cacao was a curiosity, a treasure of the Spanish court, something to be sipped in rare moments, a novelty from the distant jungles. Monasteries in Spain began preparing it in the traditional way, still spiced, still unsweetened, offered to nobles and the royal household. But the European palate was different. The fiery heat of chilies was set aside, and in its place came something new: sugar. Sugar transformed everything. The addition of sweetness turned the bitter brew into something indulgent, something luxurious. It no longer bristled on the tongue. It caressed it. And so what had been a sacred drink, a bitter tonic of power, became a fashion. In Spain, and then across Europe, chocolate was reborn. No longer was it an offering to gods or a warrior's preparation for battle. It became a drink of salons and ballrooms, of quiet conversations and courtly intrigues. Aristocrats drank it from fine porcelain, sipped it beside flickering hearths. Recipes replaced rituals, and the power once meant for gods was now enjoyed by kings and queens. Yet even as chocolate grew into a delight of the elite, it carried with it a new darkness zone, not of taste, but of human cost. To satisfy Europe's growing hunger for sweetened cacao, colonial powers turned to the brutal machinery of slavery. The equatorial lands of the New World were perfect for growing cacao trees, but harvesting the pods was a labor of backbreaking intensity. The same was true for sugarcane, the crop that sweetened the bitter past. To feed Europe's endless appetite, the Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, and British, turned to human bondage. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic to labor in fields and mills. In the humid heat of plantations from Brazil to the Caribbean and later West Africa, men and women worked beneath whips. The fruits of their bodies turned to luxury for distant palates. The human cost was staggering. Families were sundered, cultures stripped away, entire generations lost to the fields of cacao and sugar. Yet in the drawing rooms of Europe's grand cities, London, Paris, Madrid, the bitterness of that labor was hidden beneath sweet, velvety sips. Aristocrats laughed and traded secrets over cups of hot chocolate, oblivious or indifferent to the lives ground to dust behind every bean. The story of chocolate was no longer one of ceremony and devotion. It had become a story of commerce, of trade, of taxes, of wealth extracted from blood and sweat. And, as the centuries turned, the demand only grew. The dawn of the industrial age brought a new transformation. Factories rose where fields had once lain silent, and machines began to hum with the promise of speed and profit. In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Coenraad Johannes van Houten invented a process that would change chocolate forever. Using a hydraulic press, he separated much of the cacao butter from roasted cacao beans. What remained was a dry cake that could be ground into fine powder, easier to blend, cheaper to make, and lighter to transport. This powder, which we now call Dutch cocoa, laid the foundation for chocolate's next metamorphosis. In 1847, the British firm Fry Sons took the final leap. They combined the powder, some of the extracted cacao butter, and sugar, creating the first modern chocolate bar, smooth, moldable, and portable delight that could be held in the hand, not just sipped from a cup. For the first time, chocolate was no longer confined to royal courts or noble halls. It was a treat that could travel, that could slip into the lives of common folk and dreamers alike. The drink of warriors became a sweet indulgence for the world. It was the Swiss who would next elevate chocolate to new heights of indulgence. In the 1870s, Daniel Peter introduced milk chocolate by blending cacao with condensed milk, creating a creamy sweetness that transformed the familiar bitter bar into a new delight. His friend and sometimes rival Rudolf Lindt refined the process even further with the invention of the conching machine, a slow, rhythmic churn that smoothed and polished chocolate into the silky, melting texture we cherish today. These innovations shifted chocolate from a rare luxury of the elite to an accessible pleasure for the masses. No longer confined to royal tables or noble parlors, chocolate was now found in every bustling street shop and humble lunchbox across European, soon across the Atlantic. Companies like Cadbury, Nestle, and Hershey seized this new world of chocolate. They built factories that churned out confections at a scale never before imagined. Packaging became vibrant, playful, a promise of joy wrapped in bright paper and foil. Advertisements sang of delight, of childhood wonder, of sweet comfort in a bite. But in making chocolate sweet, convenient, and solid, something of its origin was lost. The divine drink of Mesoamerican gods became a snack, delicious, yes, but stripped of the ritual and reverence it once commanded. Still, a new era had begun. Chocolate had become a beloved part of daily life across continents, a taste that connected the world. By the dawn of the 20th century, chocolate was no longer a curiosity. It was an industry, a symbol of global trade and human ingenuity. In the United States, Milton Hershey saw its potential. In the late 1800s, he adapted the methods of industrial titans like Henry Ford, bringing chocolate to the factory floor and to every home. In Pennsylvania, his plant turned out chocolate for the average American, not just the privileged few. By 1900, the Hershey bar was born, and with it, a uniquely American love affair. Chocolate was no longer just a delicacy, it was a shared experience. Soldiers tucked it into their packs. Children traded it in schoolyards. Lovers gave it as tokens of affection. Valentine's Day, Easter, Halloween chocolate became their secret language. a treat wrapped in sentiment and memory. Meanwhile, the world's hunger for chocolate demanded ever more cacao. The equatorial lands of West Africa, particularly Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, became the heart of cacao farming, surpassing the lands where the bean was first revered. These were the same lands once scarred by colonialism and slavery, now repurposed to supply the world with sweetness. Labor abuses persisted. Child workers, poverty wages, and exploitative practices haunted the fields that fed the growing demand. Yet chocolate's global journey continued. In Japan, it became an ardent gesture of grace and tradition, crafted into exquisite bonbons given with ritual care. In Switzerland, it was a matter of national pride, with brands like Toblerone and Lindt defining the heights of luxury. In Mexico, chocolate found its way back to ancient roots in dishes like moleware. Bitter, earthy cacao still speaks to memory and tradition. This was chocolate's paradox, universal yet intimate, a symbol of pleasure and of power. It was born of ceremony, transformed by conquest, refined by invention, and woven into the stories of countless cultures. From the green valleys of Ghana to the snow-dusted streets of Geneva, chocolate had become part of the human story. Its flavor, a reminder of both sweet joy and bitter truth. And in the whirlwind of factories and trade, of bright wrappers and clever ads, the ancient origins of chocolate were almost forgotten. What was once the bitter, sacred drink of the gods was now an everyday pleasure, cheap, delicious, and taken for granted. Yet as the 20th century unfolded, a quiet reckoning began. A new movement stirred a return to the source. In the early 2000s, inspired by the rise of craft, coffee, and slow food, chocolate makers and artisans began to ask new questions. Where did their chocolate come from? Who grew the beans? What were the stories hidden in each pod, each careful ferment, each roast? The answers led them back to the forest floor. Unlike the industrial blends of mass-market bars, craft chocolate focused on single-origin cacao. These makers cherished the unique flavors of soil and climate, of careful fermentation. Beans from Madagascar revealed bright, citrusy notes. Those from Ecuador carried floral whispers and hints of nut. Chocolate, like wine, was found to have terroir echo of the earth in every bite. This reawakening was about more than taste. It was also about justice. Documentaries and reports shone a light on the lingering abuses in cacao fields: child labor, meager pay, the shadows of exploitation. In answer, a new generation of chocolate makers forged relationships with farmers, paying more for carefully grown beans, insisting on transparency and fairness. Labels like Fair Trade, Direct Trade, and Rainforest Alliance emerged, each a step towards dignity and sustainability. Meanwhile, chefs and scholars turned to the past, to the rituals that had first given cacao meaning. In Mexico and Guatemala, ancient drinks made with cacao, chili, and maize returned to cups once more. Elders shared recipes passed down for centuries, reviving the truth that chocolate's story began not in factory machines, but in the forest's green hush. Museums, books, and culinary pilgrimages followed, reminding the world that chocolate is culture-rich, complex, and alive. And so the story of cacao continues to evolve, each new chapter a blend of bitter and sweet, of history and hope. Heritage, struggle, and story, all of these, are bound within a single bite of chocolate. The world had changed chocolate 1,000 ways, yet the heart of it remained unchanged. The fruit of a tree, coaxed from branch to pod by human hands, prepared with care and shared with meaning. And for those willing to listen, chocolate spoke once more, not just in sweetness, but in the memories it carried. Today, chocolate is everywhere. It graces wedding feasts and birthday cakes, fills vending machines in office corridors, and melts in the hands of children around the world. It's a symbol of love and luxury, of comfort and indulgence. Yet beneath its creamy sheen lies a story as tangled and bittersweet as the first forests where it grew. It is a tale of gods and empires, of laughter and loss, of ancient rituals reborn and stolen in conquest. Chocolate, more than almost any other food, is a mirror to humanity itself. From the sacred ceremonies of the Maya to the warrior's brew of the Aztecs, from the sweat of enslaved hands in Caribbean fields to the glittering salons of European nobility, from the rations of soldiers in muddy trenches to the bright foil hearts of Valentine's Day chocolate, has moved with us through history's turning pages, reshaping itself again and again. Its legacy is layered. On one side, it is a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, to the magic that happens when one continent's harvest meets another's craft. It has inspired poets and scientists alike, its chemistry as precise as a violin's pitch, its flavor an artist's palette. On the other side lies a shadow, the bitter truth of exploitation that has long propped up its sweet promise. To this day, the modern chocolate industry still rests on the labor of farmers whose names we may never know, many of whom have never tasted the luxury they make possible. Even now, as words like fair trade and sustainable grow louder, problems of deforestation, poverty wages, and child labor remain. The cacao bean's path from jungle vine to candy aisle is still a journey marked by both wonder and injustice. Chocolate is also the story of voices lost and voices reclaimed. The indigenous peoples who first cherished cacao saw it not as a treat, but as a bridge to the secreta truth nearly erased by the centuries of conquest that followed. Today, their stories are being retold, their knowledge honored and shared once more. Each time we unwrap a bar or cradle a warm cup, we taste more than flavor. We taste history, its triumphs, and its heartbreaks. Yet in all its contradictions, chocolate endures. It transcends language and border, comforting in times of war, delighting in times of peace. It sweetens celebrations, soothes grief, and carries within it the promise of tomorrow. Perhaps that is chocolate's greatest legacy, not just its taste, but its ability to change and to be changed, to survive the rise and fall of empires, to slip from the cups of kings to the pockets of children, to adapt and endure. From bitter ritual to sweet indulgence, from forest seed to gilded box, chocolate has always meant more than it seemed. In the end, it is not simply a treat, it is a story, one that grows with every harvest, every new recipe, every hand that reaches out for a square of something sweet. The early decades of the 19th century saw a different story unfolding, a young nation restless and expanding. The United States was growing, its population surging with each passing year, and white settlers turned hungry eyes to the west. In their minds, the frontier was a land of destiny and divine right, a place for new beginnings. But what they saw as empty wilderness was anything but. That land belonged to Native American nations, who had lived there for centuries, people like the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Far from simple bands of wanderers, these were sovereign communities with complex political systems, written languages, schools, and even bilingual newspapers. They were determined to survive in a world that seemed set against them. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, had worked to blend elements of American culture with their own, drafting a constitution, building farms, sending delegates to Washington in the hope of finding common ground. Many had converted to Christianity, hoping that shared faith might offer a bridge. But for white settlers and the politicians who spoke for them, no amount of adaptation could be enough. They wanted the land. Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi passed harsh laws, erasing tribal governments and stripping away native property rights. The discovery of gold in Georgia only fed that hunger. President Andrew Jackson, a former general with no sympathy for those in the way, found a solution: remove the tribes from the east entirely. Push them beyond the Mississippi River, where they could be forgotten, and the cotton plantations could expand without restraint. This was no policy born of reason. It was ideology, the belief that white Americans had a manifest destiny, a God-given right to sweep across the continent. Those in the path of that destiny, no matter how long they had lived on the land, were to be displaced. And so, in the 1830s, the stage was set for a journey not of triumph, but of tragedy. The Trail of Tears began with the stroke of a pin on May 28, 1830, when President Andrew Jackson signed into law. The Indian Removal Act, signed into law on May 28, 1830, was legislation that would forever change the lives of tens of thousands of Native Americans. Cloaked in the language of protection and mutual benefit, it was in truth the beginning of a relentless campaign to tear entire nations from their homelands in the southeastern United States. The act gave the president authority to negotiate treaties that would swap ancestral lands east of the Mississippi for territory in what was called Indian Territory lands that would later become Oklahoma. Proponents argued that it was a mercy, a chance to shield Native peoples from the endless push of white settlers, but in reality, it was a calculated land grab dressed in polite rhetoric. Andrew Jackson, a celebrated military commander known for his ruthless campaigns against the Creek and Seminole, saw removal as the only logical path forward. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire for improvement, he declared, justifying his plan. In his eyes, they must either perish or vanish into the wilderness. Congress debated fiercely. The final votes in the Senate and House decided by the thinnest margins: 3 votes in the Senate, 5 in the House. Yet even these narrow victories set in motion one of the most tragic episodes in the nation's history. Some tribes, seeing the tide turn against them, signed relocation treaties out of fear of bloodshed. Others clung to their lands, trusting in the words of treaties promising money, supplies, and safe passage. But promises crumbled like autumn leaves, and what was billed as a peaceful transfer turned into a nightmare. Communities were uprooted, homes and farms burned, and soldiers arrived to enforce the government's will. The removal didn't just redraw borders, it severed ancient ties, destroyed lives, and laid bare the heartbreak at the core of American expansion. The Cherokee Nation refused to give in quietly. Led by Principal Chief John Ross, they turned to the courts, hoping the law that was used against them could also protect them. The Cherokee created a formal government, wrote a constitution, and asserted their sovereignty as a nation within the United States. They believed that by showing how closely their system mirrored that of the American Republic, they could hold their ground. Their battle reached the highest court in the land. In 1831's Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, they sought an injunction against Georgia's laws that stripped them of their rights. But Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the Cherokee were not a foreign nation and could not sue. It was a devastating setback. Yet hope was not lost. The following year in Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia had no authority to impose its laws on Cherokee territory. Marshall affirmed the Cherokee's status as a sovereign nation with whom only the federal government could negotiate. For a moment, it seemed justice might prevail. But President Jackson, defiant and unyielding, reportedly scoffed. John Marshall has made his decision. Now, let him enforce it. Whether those exact words were spoken or not, his actions left no doubt. He refused to act, and Georgia ignored the ruling completely. The Cherokee clung to hope, but divisions emerged. A small faction led by Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot believed removal was inevitable and signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. This treaty, made without the consent of the Cherokee government, was pushed through Congress and declared binding, sealing the nation's fate. The Cherokees' fight for justice ended not with a court's gavel, but with the sound of soldiers marching. In the spring of 1838, President Martin Van Buren ordered federal troops and state militias to Cherokee lands. The time for negotiation was over. The Treaty of New Echota had been ratified by Congress. Now, the military would enforce it with bayonets and loaded rifles. Across the rolling hills of Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama, Cherokee families were torn from their homes, with only moments to gather what they could carry. Soldiers arrived unannounced. Farms and cabins fell silent under the weight of armed men. Families had little more than the clothes on their backs. Behind them came settlers eager to seize the cleared land. Their homes were ransacked, their fields of corn and beans left to wither. Churches and schools fell to ruin, the graves of ancestors trampled by boots of conquest. More than 16,000 Cherokee were rounded up and crammed into makeshift stockade military pens that stank of fear and sweat. These holding camps were overcrowded and filthy, with little food, brackish water, and no shelter from sun or cold. Disease ran rampant. Measles, dysentery, and whooping cough swept through the camps before the forced march had even begun, stealing lives in the stagnant air of the crowded stockades. Some Cherokee were moved under immediate guard, herded onto the trail without delay. Others waited through the blistering summer, their fates suspended until the chill of autumn was deemed more suitable for travel. But those same cold rains and early snows would only sharpen the death that followed. The Cherokee called the path Nuna Dalsni, the trail where they cried. It was a journey of 200 miles or more, winding through frozen rivers, thick mud, and windswept prairies. Step by step, they trudged beneath a sky that seemed indifferent to their suffering. The march was slow and humiliating. Elderly fell and were left where they lay. Children died in the arms of mothers too, tired to wail. Families vanished, buried in shallow graves by the roadside, the only markers a stone or a prayer whispered into the cold. Some tried to keep the old ways alive, songs of remembrance carried on the wind. Sacred objects clutched close, careful lists of names of those who had passed. But hunger gnawed at their strength, and the thin clothing did little to keep out the icy breath of winter. The soldiers showed no pity. By the time the last group reached what is now Oklahoma in early 1839, more than 4,000 Cherokee had died, nearly a quarter of their entire people. This was not a relocation. It was a forced death march, a deliberate erasure of homeland, of community, of hope itself. When the last group arrived in that alien land in March of 1839, the trail ended, but the suffering did not. The losses were more than the 4,000 lives claimed by sickness, starvation, and exposure. Along that trail died a way of life, a spiritual bond with the land, and the cultural threads that had woven their people together for generations. Those who survived arrived in Indian territory weakened and grieving. They had lost not just elders who held the wisdom of the ages, but children who had carried the promise of tomorrow. Leaders who had fought with words and treaties now lay in cold graves along the trail. There was no time for mourning, no space for ceremony. The land they found was harsh, nothing like the valleys and rivers they had been forced to abandon. The promises of protection and fertile fields, written into treaties, were often broken or forgotten altogether. The wounds of the body were matched by wounds of the spirit. The Cherokee had been a nation that built schools, published newspapers, and drafted a constitution. They had believed in the law, trusted that justice could stand against conquest. In that trust, they had been betrayed, their rights ignored, their pleas dismissed. Divisions only deepened in the bitter aftermath. The treaty part of those who had signed the Treaty of New Echo Tower marked as traitors by many. In June of 1839, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot were all assassinated by their own people. Vengeance for the treaty that had delivered them to ruin. What little unity had survived, the forced removal now fractured further under the weight of grief and suspicion. Yet, even in that devastation, the Cherokee refused to vanish. They built new schools. They reformed their government. They printed their newspapers once more. They held tight to their language, their songs, their stories. The fierce resolve that had driven them to the Supreme Court, that had held them together along the Trail of Tears, became the root of a new survival. The scars of removal never fully healed. They run through generations, through family stories, through the quiet spaces of memory. The Trail of Tears is not just a chapter in the past, it is a living presence, a wound and a testament, carried by the descendants of those who walked it. And while the Cherokee Trail of Tears is the most remembered, it was not the only forced removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 cast a long and terrible shadow, reaching into the lives of many other nations each, with their own languages, lands, and heartbreak. The Choctaw were the first to be forced west, beginning in 1831. Thousands of Choctaw walked away from their homes in Mississippi and Alabama, many without wagons, many without even the barest shelter. They trudged through winter's icy rains, crossing rivers that had grown fat and fierce. Hundreds died along the way, their lives claimed by cold and hunger. A Choctaw chief would later call a trail of tears and death words that would echo through the pages of history like a haunting refrain. The Creek Nation, once mighty in the green valleys of the southeast, was next in line. Years of broken promises and bitter skirmishes with settlers had left them vulnerable, and in 1836 they too were rounded up and forced westward. Over 15 Zero Creek men, women, and children were driven from their homelands, many in chains, bound like criminals. Thousands perished along the way, some from the march's brutal conditions, others sold into slavery or scattered, families torn apart. The Chickasaw tried to negotiate their departure, securing payment for their lands before the forced journey began, but payment was delayed and supplies were scarce. Hundreds died from hunger and disease as they crossed rivers swollen with winter's wrath. Even those who had bargained for a better deal found no refuge from the grim reality of the removal. The Seminole of Florida resisted with ferocity. From 1835 to 1842, they fought in the thick swamps and tangled forests, refusing to yield. Leaders like Osceola became symbols of unbreakable defiance. But the weight of U.S. military power was a tide. Even the Seminole could not hold back forever. Thousands were captured or killed, while others fled deeper into the Everglades where their descendants still live, a testament to survival. In total, over 100 Native Americans from countless nations were forced from the lands that held their songs and stories. The government called it policy, the settlers called it progress, but to the tribes who endured it, it was nothing less than devastation. Each trail was different to each wound uniquely cut, but they all carried the same scars: betrayal, suffering, and loss. Sacred places, family homes, ancient grove saws stripped away in a relentless tide of expansion. Yet even as they walked these trails of grief, they carried with them what could never be stolen: their languages, their ceremonies, and the fierce spirit that refused to die. When the displaced Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole finally reached what was then called Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, they found not the fertile sanctuary promised to them, but a land as harsh as the memory of what they had left behind. The federal government had spoken of rich soil and secure borders, of a permanent homeland free from white encroachment. But the promises fell apart like rotting wood. The climate was alien, the seasons cruel and unpredictable. For those who had farmed gentle river valleys and ancient forests, the parched summers and bitter winters were a constant trial. Communities that had been scattered by the forced marches found themselves spread thin, separated by months of weary travel. Disease walked beside them, still cholera, smallpox, influenza picking off the weak and the worn in every new settlement. Aid that was promised livestock, tools, seed often came late, if it came at all. Supplies were spoiled or vanished in the pockets of corrupt contractors. Even in this place meant to be safe, settlers and speculators crept ever closer, hungry for land. Railroads cut through like knives, treaties were twisted or ignored, and once again, the fragile hope of sanctuary began to crumble. Yet through the worst of it, the nations fought to rebuild. The Cherokee raised their capital in Tahlequah, piecing back together the government that removal had tried to break. Schools reopened, councils gathered, and farming took root in the stubborn soil. The Choctaw and Chickasaw wrote new constitutions, built new councils and churches. Life was pieced together one thread at a time, not by forgetting, but by enduring. But the shadow of the Trail of Tears never faded. Every promise that had carried them into exile was laid bare as a lie. What was meant to be a final refuge proved only another chapter in a long, bitter story of greed, of expansion, of a nation that saw Native Americans as a problem to be solved, not a people to be honored. And so, the Trail of Tears did not end in Indian Territory. it only turned the page to another chapter in the fight for dignity and sovereignty. For decades, the memory of that march was carried quietly, spoken in the low voices of families gathered around fires, passed down in stories that would not be erased. History books were slow to speak of it, politics even slower, but the memory would not die. In Cherokee homes and Choctaw lodges, in the quiet words of Chickasaw elders, the songs of the lost were kept alive. The land itself remembered old trails, crumbling graves, and weathered records marked the way like a scar across the continent's heart. It was not just a trail of sorrow. It was a trail of endurance, of the strength that no forced march could silence. In the years that followed, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole rebuilt their nations, even as the world around them tried to erase their names. Schools opened, newspapers printed, languages kept alive in whispered prayers and defiant songs. The Trail of Tears became not just a memory of loss, but a testament to survival. It took until the late 20th century for the wider world to even begin to reckon with that history. Activists, tribal leaders, and educators worked to push the truth into the national memory. Markers were raised, commemorative trails traced the journey, and textbooks slowly found room for the stories that had been kept in silence for too long. The phrase, Trail of Tears, became part of the nation's story at last. Yet remembrance is not the same as justice. The legacy of removal dispossession, trauma, broken promises still shapes Native communities today, but in those communities, the same unyielding spirit endures. Language programs, cultural revivals, the quiet power of stories shared around kitchen tables, they are the proof that survival is not just possible, but unstoppable. The Trail of Tears is not only about what was lost, it is also about what was carried forward, the faith, the memory, and the unbreakable will to endure. Today, the Trail of Tears stands not only as a historical event, but as a living memorial path of grief and of strength. Across the country, monuments and trails mark that journey, a reminder of the steps that carried a people forward even when the world tried to leave them behind. The historic trail, designated by Congress in 1987, stretches over 50 miles across 9 states, weaving through forests, fields, and quiet towns. It marks the paths taken by those who had no choice but to walk westward, carrying with them the weight of loss and the fragile hope of survival. It invites visitors to walk, if only for a fleeting moment, in the footsteps of those who endured it. Yet true remembrance is more than stone markers or bronze plaques. For the descendants of those who walked the Trail of Tears, memory lives on in the strength of community, in the language spoken around kitchen tables, and in ceremonies that honor ancestors who faced the cold, the hunger, and the heartbreak. Today, tribal nations gather each year to remember. Memorial rides across old paths, gatherings of storytelling and songs, and programs that breathe new life into languages nearly lost. The story that was once almost silenced is now spoken with pride. Schools teach it, films portray it, poets and authors give voice to the sorrow and to the unbreakable will that carried a people forward. For Native youth, these stories are more than history. They are a testament that their identity is not rooted solely in survival, but in courage, in resistance, and in the promise of what comes next. Yet there is more to be done. The Trail of Tears stands not only as a history, but as a challenge. It asks us to reckon with the cost of so-called progress, to face the cruelty behind words like policy, and to see the ongoing struggles of indigenous peoples today. It reminds us that progress without justice is not progress at all. It is erasure. To honor the Trail of Tears is not simply to look back. It is to listen, to learn, and to uplift the voices that were once pushed to the margins. It is to understand that the story of America is incomplete without the nations who first called this land home, not just in the past, but in every chapter yet to be written. So, we remember, not only in sorrow, but in deep respect. Because even as betrayal and exile bore down, the people kept walking. They did not vanish. They endured. In the biting cold of early 1692, Salem Village, Massachusetts, was a settlement teetering on the edge of panic. Hemmed in by the dark woods of New England, this small Puritan outpost was more than just a scatter of farmhouses and meeting halls. It was a community that believed it had been chosen by God to tame the wilderness and keep sin at bay. But beneath their rigid piety simmered decades of fear and division, a slow-building tension that needed only the smallest spark to erupt. The Puritans believed that the world was a battlefield of angels and demons. In their eyes, the devil was not an idea, he was a real and present danger. Witchcraft was the devil's work, a pact with evil that corrupted the soul and threatened the very order of their godly society. To doubt these beliefs was to doubt God himself, and in Salem, no doubt was permitted. The village was divided even before the first cries of witchcraft. Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister, was a harsh and suspicious man. His sermons were filled with fire and fury, warning of the devil lurking in every shadow. He sowed fear and division among his congregation, turning neighbor against neighbor with every thunderous word. Beyond the pulpit, old grudges festered. Salem Village was locked in a bitter feud with the wealthier Salem town. Land disputes blurred the lines between faith and profit, and personal grievances twisted into accusations of spiritual treachery. The memory of bloody Native American attacks during King Philip's War haunted the settlers still. Crops had failed. Smallpox had ravaged families. In the Puritan mind, these were not misfortunes, they were signs of hidden sin. Into this cauldron of fear and suspicion came the children. In January of 1692, two young girls in Reverend Parris's own home, 9-year-old Betty Parris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams, began to behave in ways that terrified the adults around them. They screamed and thrashed, their bodies twisting into shapes no child could hold. They barked like animals, hurled objects, and spoke in words no one understood. When scolded, they cried out that they were being pinched and pricked by invisible spirits. Reverend Parris was at first unsure, but the local doctor, William Griggs, gave the only diagnosis a Puritan could accept. The girls were under an evil hand, witchcraft. Soon, others joined the chorus. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard began to suffer the same afflictions, fits, convulsions, wild cries in the night. These were not the children of the poor or the outcast. They were daughters of respected Puritan families. Their words carried weight, and when asked who had bewitched them, they pointed fingers. The first to be named was Tituba, an enslaved woman of Caribbean descent who lived in the Parris household. To the Puritan imagination, she was already suspect foreign, brown-skinned, and rumored to speak of magic and spirits. Alongside her, they named Sarah Good, a destitute woman who wandered the village begging for scraps, and Sarah Osborne, who scandalized her neighbors by refusing church and marrying her servant. Three women, each already marked as different, became the focus of a town's fear. They were arrested, thrown into cold jail cells. For the villagers, it was not just a scandal, it was a crisis of the soul. If witches truly walked among them, they had to be hunted and exposed. What had begun as a strange illness in one household had now spiraled into a consuming wildfire of panic. In Salem, no neighbor, no friend, no family member was safe from suspicion. Fear had been given a name, and it would not be easily silenced. By the early months of 1692, as more towns and villages fell into the same feverish delirium, a new and troubling kind of evidence emerged: spectral evidence. It was a weapon never before seen in any English-speaking courtroom, a tool that would shape and doom the fate of the Salem witch trials. Spectral evidence was built on the belief that a witch could send her specter to harm others while her body sat harmless in plain sight. In the cramped, flickering courts of Salem, the afflicted girls would scream and writhe, claiming to see the ghostly form of the accused pinching them, choking them, or even stabbing them. The accused would stand there, dumbstruck, while the crowd watched with wide, terrified eyes. To the deeply superstitious Puritans, this wasn't mere performance. It was proof of a covenant with the devil himself. Denials were seen as lies. Silence was taken as further evidence of guilt. But those who confessed, especially if they named others, were sometimes spared the gallows. This grim loophole led to a cascade of false confessions, each one fueling the hysteria further. Tituba, the enslaved woman who had been the first to stand accused, was also the first to confess. Under brutal pressure, she spoke of a tall man from Boston who had promised her freedom in exchange for serving him clearly, a veiled reference to the devil. She told wild tales of shadowy figures, of monstrous creatures and flying spirits. She claimed there was a book, a witch's ledger of souls signed in blood, implicating others in the village. Was Tituba's confession an act of survival, a desperate attempt to protect herself? Or was it partly shaped by the nightmarish swirl of fear and belief that had overtaken the town? Historians still debate the answer. But there is no doubt that her words fanned the flames. If witches were real and could walk unseen, then no one was beyond suspicion. Soon, more confessions followed, some ripped from prisoners by threats or torture, others offered in the hope that an admission might save a life. Those who refused to confess found themselves treated more harshly than those who did. The line between truth and terror blurred until it was gone completely. Salem's candlelit courtrooms echoed with cries and visions. Reason drowned beneath a tide of hysteria. Ministers like Cotton Mather called for caution, for calm deliberation. But their words were drowned out by the wails of the afflicted and the demands for justice. By the spring of 1692, the wave of accusations had grown so large that the village jails were bursting. What began as a local disturbance had become a full-blown crisis for the entire colony. Over 100 souls languished in jail cells, their names now synonymous with the devil's work. In desperation, Massachusetts Governor William Phips created a special tribunal, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, whose very name meant to hear and determine. This was a court designed to handle the witchcraft cases swiftly and decisively. Convening in Salem town, its panel included some of the colony's most respected men, William Stoughton, Samuel Sewell, and John Hathorne among them. Yet even these learned judges could not steady the storm. They carried the weight of Scripture, the authority of the crown, and the burden of a terrified people. But in the glow of lanterns and the chill of whispered rumors, reason and justice faltered. The court became a stage for hysteria, and the colony watched as the ancient fear of witches devoured Salem from within. Even the stature and experience of the judges couldn't protect the trials from the spreading hysteria. The rules of evidence twisted and cracked under fear's weight. Spectral testimony was embraced, rumors became fact, and skepticism was treated as treachery. In this fevered crucible, the first to face formal trial and execution was Bridget Bishop. Bridget was no stranger to Whispershire. Bright clothes and sharp tongue had long made her a target. She ran a tavern and had faced witchcraft accusations before, enough to mark her as a convenient scapegoat. In her June trial, the afflicted girls claimed to see her specter pinching and mocking them right there in the courtroom. Her firm denials only deepened suspicion. Defiance was itself seen as the devil's echo. She was convicted swiftly and hanged on June 10th, 1692, a grim start to the machinery of accusation, trial, and execution that would soon consume Salem and beyond. One by one, more prisoners were dragged before the judges. Some were pillars of their community's church deacons, skilled midwives, respected landowners. Others were already living on the margins, beggars, widows, servants. What tied them together was not proof, but rumor, envy, and the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. In these dimly lit courtrooms, the accused had little hope. Their fate rested on the screams and contortions of the accusers, on the shifting winds of politics and fear. Those who confessed and named others were often spared, at least for a time. Those who held fast to their innocence were more likely to find themselves at the end of a rope. The town's fear fed on itself. Families turned inward, desperate to survive. Neighbors betrayed each other. Ministers urged caution, but their voices were smothered by the wailing of the afflicted and the insistent demand for purification. A gallows rose on Proctor's Ledge outside Salema, silent sentinel of death as the town below offered up more names, one after another. By the height of the summer of 1692, Salem had become something beyond itself, a furnace where every whisper, every glance, was kindling for the fire of accusation. The witch trials spread like a contagion, leaping beyond Salem village and Salem town to Ipswich, Andover, Gloucester, and more. Jails overflowed, chains clanked in the night. The machinery of suspicion spared no one. The accused came from all corners of life: the homeless and the wealthy, newcomers and old families, those who had nothing and those who once held everything. Even children were caught in the snare. Even ministers' wives were not safe. Once the machine of fear was set in motion, it consumed everything in its path. Families were torn to pieces, husbands and wives naming each other to save themselves, children testifying against parents, friends turning on friends. To question the trials was to risk accusation. Doubt was heresy. To suggest that witches might not be real was to stand accused of serving them. In the flickering light of the courtrooms, the afflicted girls carried the trials forward. They claimed to see phantom animals, black dogs, and spectral birds sent by the accused to torment them. They fainted, shrieked, and fell into fits of writhing that seemed as real as the fear in the eyes of those who watched. Their performances were both a horror and a fascination, and the court took every gasp and cry as the devil's own signature. By the end of summer, more than 150 souls had been taken from their homes and locked in cells. The gallows worked steadily. Sarah Good, a homeless woman, was hanged in July after refusing to confess. Her refusal was seen not as courage but as defiance of God's order. Rebecca Nurse, a grandmother respected in both church and community, met the same fate despite desperate pleas for her innocence. Her death was a chilling sign. No one was safe. Still, the net of accusations widened. Children as young as 5 were jailed in the name of salvation. Entire families were crammed into cells. Salem had lost its hold on sense and compassion, consumed by the very evil it believed it was fighting. Fear ruled Salem, now fear, twisting justice, corroding memory, and silencing every voice that tried to resist. What had begun as a handful of strange illnesses and wild stories had become something much darker, a society devouring itself, one whispered name at a time. As summer's heat gave way to the sharp winds of autumn in 1692, the Salem witch trials reached. The gallows on Proctor's Ledge had become a grim landmark on the horizon, its silhouette, a constant reminder of the terror that had consumed Salem. Here, under the open sky, cries for mercy were met with silence, swallowed by the finality of the noose. These executions were not hidden, they were public rituals of condemnation, meant to teach a lesson that some found too dreadful to watch, and others watched with a disturbing curiosity. One by one, the condemned were brought to the scaffold. Bound in ropes, they prayed softly, trembling but unbroken. Then the trapdoor fell away, and another life ended in the name of supposed righteousness. In all, 19 souls were hanged as witches, 14 women, 5 men. Each maintained their innocence until the end. Their final words often whispered prayers or trembling recitations of psalms. None were granted a proper burial. As convicted witches, their bodies were denied the sanctity of churchyards. Some were buried in hastily dug, unmarked graves. A few were quietly reclaimed by family in secret vigils under cover of night. Yet the most brutal death of all did not come from the hangman's rope. Giles Corey, an elderly farmer of 81 and husband to the accused Martha Corey, refused to enter a plea at trial. He knew that to plead would risk forfeiting his land to the state of fate he would not accept, so he stood silent, and the authorities answered his silence with pressing, a gruesome punishment rarely used. Stripped and laid out in the dirt, heavy stones were piled on his chest, one by one, until he could no longer breathe. For 2 days he endured, refusing to cry out or beg for release. His last words, spoken with the final breath of defiance, were said to be, "More weight." In dying wordlessly, he became a symbol of the tragic injustice that had gripped Salem. In the jails, those not yet called to the gallows faced horrors of their own: Pregnant women gave birth in filthy cells, their cries echoing off damp stone. The sick died of neglect, their bodies wasting away as they waited for trial. Families were forced to pay for the food that kept them alive and for the iron shackles that bound them. Some remained in these prisons for months after the last trial ended, their lives suspended by fear and uncertainty. As the first leaves of autumn fell in 1692, Salem had claimed more lives to witchcraft hysteria than any other place in American history. What began with a few whispered suspicions had ended in a torrent of blood and broken faith. Even as the executions paused, the soul of Salem bore a scar that would never fade. By September's end, the fever that had burned so hot finally began to cool. The turning point came not from judges or priests, but from the slow, creeping doubt that took root in the minds of the people. If someone like Rebecca Nursey, woman of unshakable faith, could hang as a witch, then who among them could be trusted? When Martha Corey, a loyal churchgoer, and even Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of the colonial governor himself, were named as witches, it became clear that the hysteria had turned against the very pillars of the community. It was then that voices of reason grew louder. Reverend Increase Mather, a towering figure in the Puritan world and father to Cotton Mather, delivered a sermon that cut through the panic. He denounced the use of spectral evidences, the very foundation of many convictions. "It is better that 10 suspected witches should escape," he declared, "than that one innocent person be condemned." It was a radical shift, a quiet but damning rebuke of the court's methods. Other ministers began to echo his words. Families of the condemned spoke out in public, refusing to let their loved ones' names be lost to shame. And beyond Salem, neighboring towns looked on in horror, distancing themselves from the madness that had swept through the village like a plague. Faced with a mounting tide of criticism and political unease, Governor William Phipps took action in October 1692. He dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, that tribunal of fear and suspicion. In its place, he created a new courton that would no longer accept spectral evidence, that would once again weigh testimony with care. The effect was immediate. Most of those still imprisoned were quickly found not guilty. The few who had been convicted in the last days of the frenzy were soon pardoned. The final execution stopped, but the damage had already been done. 19 hanged, 1 crushed under stones, more than 100 jailed, and countless others left scarred. Salem's fever had burned itself out, but its ashes still smoldered. The shift in the air was slow, almost reluctant. Though the courts had changed, the last prisoners would not be freed until months, even years later. And for the community, the reckoning would take far longer still. In that cold autumn, the panic began to fade. The gallows fell silent. The screams of the afflicted gave way to a hush. Salem was left to face the bitter truth that it had been ruled not by witches, but by its own fear. By the time the final prisoners were released in 1693, Salem had more than just empty cells. It had guilt-haunting and relentless. The trials had ended, but their echoes filled every home and every church pew, a silence filled with shame and the weight of all that had been done in the name of faith and justice. As the years went by, those who had played their part in the madness began to reckon with it. Judge Samuel Sewall's apology in 1697 stood out among them. On a cold January day of fasting and prayer, he rose before Boston's South Church and admitted his share of blame, his voice heavy with shame and a plea for God's forgiveness. It was a rare, humbling act, a gesture that opened the door for others to follow. Yet not all would admit wrongdoing. Some judges and accusers stood by their actions, insisting they had acted out of duty. But as the years passed, a consensus took hold, especially among the clergy, that the court had lost its way and that the fevered panic had done terrible harm. Even Cotton Mather, once a fierce defender of spectral evidence, softened in his later writings, though he never fully let go of the trial's ghost. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the first girls to cry witch, stood before her church and confessed her guilt. She said she had been misled by Satan, that her lies had cost innocent lives. She begged God and her neighbors for forgiveness. Her confession was among the few that named the victims directly, a small light of truth in a dark chapter. The families of those accused fought for decades to clear their loved ones' names. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature restored civil rights to many of those convicted and granted some compensation to their heirs, though the pain was not so easily erased. Not every name was cleared, and not every family received what was owed. Over time, Salem worked to mend itself. The town became less a place of punishment and more a symbol of warning about what happens when reason is drowned by panic, when courts yield to fear, and when faith is twisted into a blade. The reckoning had begun, but full justice, as history so often shows, remained just out of reach. More than 3 centuries have passed since the last noose was tied in Salem. The memory of the witch trials endures etched into American consciousness, not as a tale of witches, but as a lesson in the danger of unchecked suspicion. Today, the phrase Salem witch trials has become shorthand for hysteria and false accusation, invoked in courtrooms and classrooms, in debates and in political speechisa, reminder of how easily fear can turn neighbor against neighbor, and how quickly the machinery of power can become a weapon. Modern Salem acknowledges its past with a complicated embrace. Museums and memorials draw visitors from around the world. The Salem Witch Trials Memorial, dedicated in 1992 to mark 300 years since the hangings, features 20 granite benches. Each bears the name of an executed victim, no crimes listed, for there were not only names, dates, and final words, tributes to dignity and a refusal to be forgotten. Yet Salem's story is more than just museums and tours. It is a mirror to human nature, a stark portrait of how fear can become contagious and how the hunger for righteousness can so easily become a force for ruin. It shows how courts can betray justice when guided by terror rather than truth. Arthur Miller's play The Crucible gave new life to these old tragedies, using them to warn of the Red Scare and McCarthyism of the 1950s. Miller reminded a new generation that witch hunts do not always involve witches and that the past is never as distant as it seems. The descendants of the accused and the accusers still walk the streets of Massachusetts and beyond. Some carry the quiet weight of ancestral shame. Others hold fierce pride in the resilience of their forebears. In 2001, more than 300 years after the final gallows fell, Massachusetts formally exonerated the last 5 victims, finally clearing all the names that had been tarnished by Salem's panic. The witch trials of Salem lasted barely more than a year, but their shadow stretches across centuries. They remind us of a truth that must be defended always, that justice can falter under the pressure of fear, that reason must stand even when suspicion and zeal scream louder, and that the gravest injustices can happen not in secret, but in the clear light of day.